All right, hello and welcome to Office Hours, where we answer questions, give philosophical perspectives, formulate and explore arguments, and deep dive into particular topics of your choice. Ian has asked a very lengthy question, which is a refinement of an original version. So I will read the refined version, and then we'll get into it. Ian asks, and this is in reference to a standalone video I did about the Border Patrol and ICE incidents in Minnesota and Minneapolis and what the context of that is. The sort of difficult situation we're in with immigration and so forth. Ian asks, while I agree with much of what you have said in your Minnesota video, I am less convinced about the long-term strategies that are promoted. Why assume that delaying civilizational collapse is less dangerous than allowing our failed institutions to resolve themselves, especially when the current multi-ethnic, multicultural experiment shows clear signs of late-stage civilization decline? Wouldn't it be better to prepare for an inevitable power vacuum to occur in order for a new nation to rise out of the turmoil rather than trying to maintain a failing order? Our democratic constitutional republic seems to reward psychopaths to run center stage rather than fostering proper stewardship for its citizens. This is something I think I mentioned in the video, the psychopathic nature of politics. Herman Hoppe argues that monarchy functions as a lesser evil than the system we have now. The saying goes that power corrupts, but if you are born into it, the incentives are different from the types of characters it attracts. End quote. So this is like that conclusion there is like a paraphrasing of the Frank Herbert correction to Lord Acton's axiom that power corrupts. Herbert says, no, power doesn't corrupt, power attracts the corrupt. There's, I think, a degree of truth to both. But there are two parts to this question, which is beautiful in its detail and preciseness. So there's a broad part to this question, which also addresses the initial version of the question that got refined. And then there's a more precise component of this question, which is more technical and legal, constitutional, what's going on with our country legally and so forth. The broad part of the question, which I want to address first, which is not expressed directly in this language, although it was in the initial version of the question, is the question of accelerationism. Why is it better to delay civilizational collapse, assuming it's kind of inevitable? Why try to keep fixing what's broken and not just start over? Isn't it better to just clean slate, start fresh? Or is that what... And accelerationism is the name of this idea. We have to be, I think, very careful about intentions when it comes to accelerationism. Accelerationism is a lot newer than we think it is. You can go back to Hesiod, where he's writing in his Theogony about like the different generations, and him saying he wished he could get through to get to the next cycle where it was like the golden age again. Greg Nodge does a brilliant job analyzing some of the problems with the assumptions we have about that particular generational cycle, which we could argue is maybe a progenitor to the Strauss-Howe idea. Apologies for this technical stuff. It's a digression. But where accelerationism really comes from is a very recent philosopher, like early 2000s philosopher named Nick Land. Was born in 1964. He's still doing interviews and stuff these days. You can find him around. I just saw a recent interview with him and oh gosh, the Russian guy, the Eurasianism guy. Anyways, his name will come to me. I wasn't thinking about him 5 minutes ago, but Nick Land is a very interesting character. To be totally honest, I'm not entirely sure why he gets grouped in with the right at all. He's labeled a part of the NRX before the alt-right went like full white nationalist in Charlottesville. It was a fairly broad amalgamation of a lot of different philosophers. There was human biodiversity. There were just kind of general libertarians. There were monarchists and neo-monarchists like Curtis Yarvin. And he got grouped in with Nick Land for reasons I'm not entirely sure why. They both nominally argue for monarchism, but how they get there and the reasoning for it is so dramatically different. It's hard to like. It's like sharing the name, but really nothing else. But Nick Land is really the creator of the philosophy of accelerationism. He was influenced by Guattari and Deleuze and Marx, and there are ideas very similar to accelerationism that you can find in Guattari and Deleuze, and James Lindsay has been very good at pointing out the accelerationist tendencies of certain Marxist activists who want to accelerate the contradictions, to move through this sort of Hegelian dialectical progress that they think is inevitable, and move towards the culminating end point, the final point of history, which is a Hegelian idea. Most people know it from Francis Fukuyama. But there's an idea underneath all of this, which we can really find with Hegel, that there is an inevitable logic to history and a trajectory upon which society will inexorably move. And you can't really stop that. You can maybe slow it down. You can be agents of it, but you can't stop it. But perhaps you can accelerate it. Perhaps you can move towards that final point. And Guattari and Deleuze argued that the left could, the sort of post-structuralist, postmodern left, could embrace selective aspects of capitalism, the sensuousness of it, perhaps, in order to push the contradictions and to push through capitalism to get to the other side faster. But that's not what Nick Land is doing. Nick Land's goal is completely different. Nick Land's accelerationism is technological capitalism is so powerful, and it has escaped human control. There's perhaps a Heideggerian question of whether it was even in human control to begin with. Well, if you read Heidegger's Question Concerning Technology and just assume all of Heidegger's worst fears are taken for granted as true, that's basically Nick Land. I'm oversimplifying. Nick Land is a very complex, to the point of incoherent thinker, in my opinion. But he is complex, and so he's saying, well, we're going into post-human techno-capitalism whether we want to or not. So let's get there already. Give up. Embrace the apocalypse, to borrow his language. And he's just his accelerationism, and again, it is not irrelevant. Pardon the Orwellian phrasing there, the double negative, but it's the correct one. It is not irrelevant that the coining of accelerationism is an accelerationism of defeatism. It's an accelerationism of giving up, and giving up humanity itself. It's very H.P. Lovecraft, really. So, and he has interesting things to say about hyperstition, which, if you read Nick Land's ideas about hyperstition, a hyperstition, by the way, is a is basically a meme that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like it's a superstition, but it gets repeated so that it brings itself into being. And in the context of Hegelian dialectic and stuff, it is very rational to question what Nick Land's real goals are. Like, in pushing this embrace the apocalypse rhetoric, is he trying to generate some antithesis? He's doing some kind of linguistic sorcery, and he is an occult thinker as well, like explicitly. So it's not, I don't think, an overstatement to say Nick Land is a sorcerer of some sort. His real goal might be very different than what he's writing about. We can't really know. I'm frankly just not that interested in him. I think he's like guessing his motives is like playing a guess where the iocane powder is with the Princess Bride. He's doing something weird. Who knows if it will work? What working would even mean? But I bring up this character Nick Land to point out that accelerationism isn't always about fixing things. Sometimes it's about getting to defeat faster. Now, obviously, that's not what all accelerationists are trying to do. We can delineate accelerationism into two kinds here. There's strategic accelerationism, where we're going to try to do some kind of aikido where we redirect our adversary's enemy against them and do something cool. Or there's a kind of defeatist accelerationism where it's like, well, we're going to lose anyway, so like why not just step on the gas and make it like a clean death, But I think both, when we look at accelerationism at a grand political and civilizational level, we're actually seeing the same possible error in both kinds, both the strategic and the defeatist. And it is worth pondering just how different those two actually are. We'll get more into that later. But both commit, I think, the same possible error in their assumptions about what they think they know. How sure are you of the Hegelian dialectic process, that there is an inexorable logic to how things are going to play out, that everything is predictable and will follow this set sequence, and maybe we can slow it down, maybe we can accelerate it, but we can't get in the way of this freight train of history. The idea that we know enough to know what's coming at a broad level, and this sneaks into our language. Ian used the phrase late stage collapse to describe our civilization. You hear this a lot when people describe late stage capitalism, as if they know the stages of capitalism, as if they're so sure that capitalism is even a real system, which is its own interesting question. I would encourage everyone to look up the history of the word capitalism and where that came from, and to see if capitalism actually describes a system which is a system. And what does it mean for a system to be a system? And does capitalism even qualify? And if it's not a system, perhaps we're living in some kind of system that we've been mislabeling as capitalism, and it's really some other kind of, financial feudalism or who knows what. But like the idea that we're in late stage something, how sure are we of what cycle we are in? And what cycle is actually the dominant cycle that defines and moves and describes our age? We can be tracking some small cycle and lose track of some new wave that's rising up on our horizon. There's one of the most interesting books from another sorcerer I read about a year ago. You might know the name George Soros. Wrote a book called The Alchemy of Finance. It was a very bold book, and I think a very perhaps overly self-important book. on the very last page, on the last paragraph of the last page, Soros presents himself as the dialectical synthesis of Hegel and Marx. Okay, the quality of the idea he's presenting, I'm sure, sorry, the scope of the idea he's presenting, I don't think qualifies for that level of grandiosity. But he still makes an interesting point. And George Soros's argument is that the economy, and maybe many other things besides just the economy, is what he would call a reflexive environment. And what a reflexive environment is an environment that responds to being modeled. As in, as soon as you model it, it changes. It reacts to itself. It's like it's looking in a mirror. And if you present a model of itself, it wants to respond to its own model. And reflexive environments, for this reason, are unmodelable. We've seen this in real time. What's his name? Into the Cryptoverse. I want to say Benjamin Cowan, I think, who's the best predictor of this last crypto market cycle, which I completely missed, by the way. Apologies to anyone who followed me in my Cardano explorations. That notwithstanding, this is not about the economy. This is not about Bitcoin. This is not about anything like that. But one of the things that Benjamin Cowan says is that all models are wrong. Some models are useful, but they're all still wrong. And that follows what George Soros is saying too. And they're wrong because people are reading them. And what are the models modeling? Well, they're modeling people's behavior, So any model of history is also a reflexive environment. We are aware of the Strauss-Howe theory of generational cycles. We are aware of these kinds of things. It's important to point out, I think, and this is an interesting rabbit hole for people who are really into this sort of thing, but maybe aren't familiar with the term. Nick Land's philosophy really came out of, or maybe founded, I'm not sure of the precise relationship his work has with this field, but is deeply enmeshed with a very esoteric and obscure, but nonetheless very powerful field called cybernetics. This is actually one of the field of cybernetics is the place we get the word like cyber from in relation to the internet and everything. But cybernetics is not about like the study of the internet. It comes from the Greek word kubernetes, which, we turn the U, Y, and make it into an English Y sound. So it's kuber becomes kyber, cyber, because the C becomes an S sound. And Kubernetes means steersman. It is the study of steering and control, specifically the study of inter-organizational communication and feedback loops within a living organism or an institution or a machine. It's the study of these feedback loops. And so it should be exactly the field where we would think about reflexive environments. But the problem is reflexive environments sort of risk breaking the whole field of cybernetics if it breaks the idea that human beings or other living organisms are like large institutions like nations and state. There's an open question that we get from the Republic. Is the city like the man? In some ways, perhaps, maybe in other ways, not so much. But for people who want to get further into the work of Nick Land and cybernetics, that is an interesting field you can look into. But that's a digression. I think the point about reflexive environments and the generally not just complex but chaotic in the technical sense of the term make these kinds of things unpredictable. Even in principle, it's worse than the weather, and so I am distrustful of all grand accelerationist ideas from Hegel forward, for all the reasons that Hegel is wrong. And the essential reason that Hegel is wrong is because Hegel's dialectic, his spiritual dialectic, which Marx replaced with dialectical materialism, is that every action in politics and in history will create its own counterforce. And this counterforce, the collision between the initial action and the counterforce, will result in some kind of synthesis. And this will flow in a more or less logical fashion towards some culminating endpoint. And Hegel's idea was this is the universe coming to know itself as its own creator, as God. Marx thought the ultimate conclusion of this is basically communism, but that's like, even communism is a means to an end of the complete liberation of man as man from all external contingency. And that's, you're not going to get that from the Communist Manifesto. You have to go back to his contribution to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right. It's the best and most interesting thing Marx ever wrote, and you won't understand Marx unless you read that. A digression. The problem is that each event has more than one possible counter. What is the opposite of white? Is the opposite of white black? Or is the opposite of white clearness? Is the opposite of white nothing at all on the color spectrum? The opposite of white depends a lot on whether you're dealing with light or paint. And the opposite of, is the opposite of communism fascism? Communists will kind of talk that way because in their view, the later communists came to believe, maybe the inevitable trajectory of history doesn't take us only to communism. It could also take us to fascism. Ergo, if you're not a communist, you're a fascist, because those are the only two possible routes our dialectical theory of history will allow for in the long run. So, anti-fascist, Antifa, is code for just communist. That's what that is. But the fascists and communists have a lot in common, and not just their belief in Hegelian history. They have a lot of other things in common. One might say, maybe the more proper, Hayek would argue that the actual antithesis to communism is not fascism, but libertarianism. You can take issue with that too. I would. But there are many different counters. There are many different possible alternatives to any one given event or idea. And when there are more than one possible alternative, there is no logical trajectory that follows from this, Now, does that mean that all accelerationism is therefore bad? Because there's a danger of this logic leading to, all action is bad, because you don't know what the outcome is going to be. And we don't need to go that far. So with those questions asked but not answered just yet, let's get into some of the more, I said there's a broad section and there's a more precise part of this question, which is the question of the Constitution and isn't it better to prepare for things? So let's get into those. Isn't it good to prepare for a power vacuum? Yes. Yes, it is good to prepare for a power vacuum. And by the way, I moved my family across the state in part for this reason back in 2018. And by the way, it's good to prepare for, contingencies, even if you don't think it's necessarily likely. That's called insurance. It's good to be prepared. Don't obsess over it, but be prepared, So yes, it's good to prepare for the power vacuum, but But that doesn't necessarily mean a power vacuum is coming. It doesn't necessarily mean a collapse is coming. You know, there are now. All that said, there are very serious problems we're facing. I saw a very, very good analysis done by a guy named Cameron Macgreggor, who I had not heard of until literally earlier today. And I saw his video on, it was called Ice is Just the Beginning, I think. I'll post a link in the follow-up. And he basically did a fascinating job of tying America's current political crisis to the Japanese economic experiments that have been going on since the early 2000s. Apparently, America's economy is very deeply tied to Japan's and Japan's financial models and financial institutions, and they have not been doing things very well. They've been playing very risky games, and their economy is apparently in free fall, is looking very, very bad. Which is a foreshadowing to some bad things that are coming our way too. You know, that's a problem for our financial institution. We've got a tremendous amount of debt. No one has any idea what to do about it. You know, your guess is as good as mine. How do we solve that? Can it be solved? An even bigger problem than the debt, which I mentioned in my ICE video that Ian was asking this in response to, share some similarities with Cameron Macgregor's video, is the immigration situation we're in. We are in a civilization-threatening level of immigration. It's a serious problem. I won't go over the details again now, but you know, this immigration problem didn't come out of nowhere. As Cameron Macgregor pointed out, and as I wrote back in 2018, on the coming Civil War, which is a blog post. I'll post a link to that too. You know, we have the immigration situation that we have because it was politically advantageous to one side. Now, interestingly, which side that was has shifted. It was politically advantageous for Republicans at some points, or at least some of the business interest of Republicans. Maybe not Republicans as Republicans, but like Koch brothers were a big... Bernie Sanders was actually very amusingly pointing out that open borders was a Koch brother conspiracy. And Bernie Sanders himself was pushing for closing the borders to protect American labor. So not a bad position. Big win for Bernie on that point. But, you know, the tables kind of turned when Trump started to run. And then Bernie became, well, no. So... you know, because there is political benefit to one side, and that side has now constructed their political constituency around basically nothing other than being anti-white. Like why is it that American Muslims are in a political alliance against, or with, rather, homosexuals? There's a very thin line preventing a lot of defenestration going on there. You know, what's the unifying thing? Well, it's the white oppressor narrative, right? The white oppressor narrative, the white oppressor myth, and I don't mean myth as in falsehood or truth, I mean it as the sacred story that unifies this team, is white is bad. Specifically straight white male, maybe straight white Christian male. You know, you can get as precise as you want about it. But like that unifying story means that if that is repudiated, if the wave of votes that is coming in through the border is undone, then the political left in its current constitution, in its current construction, it is gone, is destroyed. And the consequences for people who were a part of that might be kind of severe, and they know that. So they'll fight. And we're seeing the beginning of that violence in Minnesota. As sort of a trial run. It doesn't necessarily have to go hot. Again, we can't know things with certainty. We can just see trajectories and likelihoods based on what we're looking at. So we are in a very serious problem, and the problem is not just debt and immigration, it's also legal. Many libertarians are very strongly attached to the Constitution with understandable loyalty. I say this as someone who thinks the Constitution, the American Constitution, might be the greatest civic document ever written. It's extraordinary. That said, anything written can only do so much. And there's another wonderful book that I will recommend to people who are interested called The Age of Entitlement by Christopher Caldwell. Terrible title, phenomenal book. And what Christopher Caldwell articulates is basically that we, ever since the Civil Rights Act passed, which Christopher Caldwell supports the mission of the Civil Rights Act. Ruth Bader Ginsburg was promoted as this great, progressive justice. Many people forget that Ruth Bader Ginsburg actually opposed Roe versus Wade. Now, why would Ruth Bader Ginsburg oppose Roe versus Wade? Well, she opposed Roe versus Wade because she thought the legal mechanism by which Roe versus Wade protected abortion was bad. She said this is basically built upon protecting the right of privacy of doctors. Like this doesn't make any sense. This doesn't have anything to do with the parent's right or woman's bodily autonomy or anything. It's like it's a bad legal justification for even for an outcome that we want to have. And in the same way, Christopher Caldwell, while supporting the ideals of the Civil Rights Act and the goals of more racial harmony and all that, says the way that the Civil Rights went about doing it, the Civil Rights Act specifically, was it basically created an alternative foundation for the Constitution itself. It created a second Constitution. And the Constitution of 1789 and the Constitution of 1964? 64, I think, right? 62 or 64. I don't remember. It doesn't matter. These two constitutions are actually in conflict. They have fundamentally different foundations. And the latter is undermining the former. And it's a problem. And what Cameron Macgreggor points out is that the immigration crisis that we've created for ourselves based on political advantage has created sort of an additional constitutional crisis, which is we no longer recognize the legal distinction between citizen and non-citizen. Just as the Civil Rights Act made us question, are we talking about natural rights or civil rights, which are different? A natural right exists prior to the government. A civil right is created by the government. And this very subtle difference plays out in very, very large ways. And in the same way that the distinction between citizen and non-citizen also big. It basically makes the Constitution as written from 1789 a dead document. Now, the silver lining to this is there is a question as to what is a constitution. Here, I would highly recommend. Sorry for all the reading assignments here. De Maistre, Joseph de Maistre has a wonderful work on the substance of political constitutions. I'll have to remember the precise title. I'll include a link. There's all kinds of readable versions online, where he basically says it is impossible to actually write down a political constitution of a nation. It either exists in the hearts and the biological substrate of the people themselves, the culture of the people, not biological to make it like purely racial or ethnic, because it's not. But it either exists in the people itself, in which case a written document is kind of superfluous, or it does not exist in the people, and no written document can ever provide that. Now, I think one thing that he overlooks is the supporting nature. And I think one of the wonderful things we've seen in the United States relative to countries like Britain or Australia is our written Bill of Rights has allowed us to protect and shield the things we care about for some time. It's not perfect, as we have seen. But just in the same way that you can say, well, like, a monogamous pair bond either exists or it doesn't, and if someone does something, then it just wasn't there. Like, the socially enforced institution of marriage does help to safeguard, the monogamy that people are trying to maintain. So we can use social institutions and technologies like written constitutions or laws, to help reinforce things that exist within us prior to the written document. But there's still a serious grain of point to De Meister's argument that I think can serve as a kind of silver, not just a silver lining, it's more like a white pill, because in the absence of America's written constitution, if the same sorts of people who wrote the first constitution are still here and had to write up a new constitution, we would probably write something very, very similar. Now, things have changed. We are obviously not the same people as we once were, for worse or for better, or maybe for better and for worse in a variety of different ways. But if we are different people, how could we have maintained a constitution that came from a different body of people? So there are all kinds of interesting questions there. But the important point that brings us back to the question of accelerationism is when we see more precise situations, and I'm not just talking about constitutional issues, but even smaller legal situations, more precise contexts offer us opportunities for actionable and not vain, quixotic uses of accelerationism. And this can be both for defeat and for strategy. I'll give a couple examples. One of my favorite recent philosophers, and that is Scott Adams, who left us earlier this year, but is still worth going to check out once in a while, would tell this story of a time he worked as a bank teller. Now, this bank had rules about how you were supposed to vet customers coming in. But if you actually followed all those rules, you would never get anything done because they're so extensive and they're so prohibitively time-consuming that the tellers just kind of go through it and they just use their judgment to go through the customers and either give out loans or whatever. But one time, Scott Adams got in trouble because, I don't know, cashed a bad check or something, because he had not followed the rules. And he was punished for not following the rules that no one actually followed. So what he did is he said, oh, I'm supposed to follow these rules, huh? Okay. And so he used a tactic called malicious compliance. And he followed those rules to the letter. And he had lines going out the door of customers waiting very angrily to, do bank things. And the manager would come over and be like, what's going on here? You got to get through these customers. And Scott's like, I'm following all the rules. And what's the manager going to say? They've already chastised him for not following the rules. Because of his malicious compliance, the bank had to think through and reevaluate and ultimately changed a bunch of the rules to make it more functional, or at least not to hold their employees to impossible standards of, accountability over things they couldn't possibly do. So malicious compliance would be an example of more precise strategic accelerationism. It's pushing the contradictions in order to change things. An example of defeatist accelerationism, one I'm very familiar with, is resigning in a game of chess. You know, it allows you to accelerate through the loss and start a new game, hopefully having learned something from it. Sometimes it's valuable to play all the way to the end, so it really like drills your mistake into your head, you know. But there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with, oh, I'm gonna lose this, so like, yeah, okay, good game, you won. That's fine. Sometimes. So, but what's important in both cases is both in that precise chess game and in a situation of a business environment where you're experienced and you've been there for a while and you understand how things work, you are not in some complex, chaotic, reflexive environment. You're not in some the grand context of history or civilization. We're looking at individual people and a game or a business. So there it is possible to identify the relevant, meaningful factors that will change things and what will be causal in given outcomes. That makes accelerating either in a strategic or a defeatist manner meaningful. But regarding the points that Ian brings up about Hoppe, Hans Hermann Hoppe, and monarchism, and I'll leave a link to the video he posted. It's only 3 minutes. It's very fun. Hans Hermann Hoppe is a fun character, and he's right about a lot of things. He's one of the best people to point out the problems of democracy since Socrates. Democracy, the God That Failed is on my list of books that I should have read. I probably will never read it because I feel like I understand the thesis and I already agree with it. So why bother? But monarchism has its own set of problems. And while I tend to like Curtis Yarvin and his royalism, or it's monarchism, and Hans Hermann Hoppe's kind of libertarian justification for monarchism, which can sound very strange to many people, but it's a good argument. Hans Hermann Hoppe points out there are problems with monarchs, but at least you don't have the incentives for psychopathy. And the psychopathy of politics is something I think I talked about in the ICE video. It's also something I talked about with Ed Herman in one of our more recent Solar Sunday live streams on the Order of Fire YouTube channel. I'll include a link to all this. You can check that out if you like. But how did the monarchs acquire power in the first place? They acquired power by taking it, right? So they might say, well, an inherited monarch doesn't suffer from this tendency. Well, yeah, they don't, but there's a cycle here. When the inherited monarch is not fighting for power, then his underlings, his advisors, his dukes and court supporters and so forth, they still feel the draw of power or are drawn to power by their own corruption or whatever. And if the inherited monarch becomes some feckless leader who is benevolently kind of incompetent or whatever, then there's a real question of who's the actual monarch in charge. And this is where Curtis Yarvin, I think, and his notion of monarchism becomes really helpful and useful. We can talk about it as monarchic functionalism. Who is actually in charge? We have a nominal leader. Does anyone believe that President Biden was in charge? Many people would say even George Bush wasn't really in charge. That was all Dick Cheney all the time, who, interestingly enough, was not in the Epstein files. I guess a bit of a win for Dick Cheney, I guess. So, and Nietzsche points this out too. When you have leaders, royalty, who lose the martial feeling that characterized the aristocrats of old, and they are eventually overtaken by business leaders who he described as having like business, like leaders of industry with pudgy fingers. He says that's when the underclass says, oh, it looks like anybody can do this. Well, let us roll the dice and flip the tables and see how things turn out. Thus socialism is born. Quoteth Nietzsche. I think he's right. So I think Hans Hermann Hoppe's point is valid. There is value to inherited monarchism. There's an incentive alignment of like, oh, if the monarch owns this thing, then there's more incentive to protect it and care for it rather than just a thing you can possess that you can sell and leave and other things. And, you know, if your child is going to inherit this, then you want to take better care of it and all that. And there are good arguments there. But there are functionalist arguments that say none of that actually matters. It's still psychopaths all the way back. And if we go back to Plato, it's not just psychopaths back 100 years, it's psychopaths back 2,300 years. It's going back to the 30 tyrants, and it's going back to freaking, you know, all kinds of crazy people. So, the silver lining here, though, is that as crazy as someone like, I don't know, Alcibiades was, there are people like Socrates that have his ear. And Scott Adams said that the person with the best ideas is always in charge, which sort of makes you wonder, when Plato talks about the philosopher king, was he talking about some unreachable ideal, or was he speaking descriptively? Was he just speaking functionally, that philosophers actually do rule? Not that they should rule, but that they do rule. Always. In every case. Alexander Dugin, one might argue, is ruling Russia. You know, who is the philosopher that's ruling the United States now? I actually don't know. We could throw out a few names, but food to consider. So there's a hidden we in this question, though. Like, what do we do about it? What should we do? Our democratic constitutional republic seems to reward psychopaths. What are we going to do about this? Should we try to fix it, or should we try to repair it? At the great takeaway from Plato, and the Republic in particular, which is really a great introduction to an answer to this question at many different levels of accelerationism, and what do we do about a corrupt government? What do we do when we seem to be run and ruled by a PDF file, because that's apparently the new Gen Z, I don't know, horrible psychopaths? You know, what do we do about that? Do we rise up and try to replace it and succumb to the same forces that have been at work in politics for 2,300 years, if not longer? Do we withdraw from politics entirely and just like exit the cave and leave all the squabbles to the people who care, like people cheering for some football game and arguing over the halftime show or something? What we see in Plato is neither of those. And it begins with the relationship between the city and the individual. Because at some point, there is a part of our soul that is leading us in our actions, that is leading us to look at ambiguous situations and incline us by nature towards tearing it all down or building it up. You know, which part of our soul, which character, which personality within us is driving what we want? You know, there are all kinds of personality theories out there. There's Myers-Briggs, there's Big Five, there's all these. All of them seem to suck. So maybe it's like Benjamin Cowan's thing. All of them are wrong. Some of them are useful. I've been somewhat surprised in the last 5 to 6 years by how strangely useful astrology can be. This is gonna make my more materialist friends be like, "The fuck are you talking about, Chris?" I don't know. I can't explain it, but my favorite one, and the one that I think is most predictive, more so than astrology, more so than anything else, and the best is what I like to think of as literary theory, which is, what is this person's core motivation? Because this is how good writers write. It's also, incidentally, how the CIA, what the CIA uses to gauge potential agents, and it is also more or less what Plato uses in his description of the character of different cities and their citizens. What is the character of a democratic citizen? What's the character of an aristocratic citizen? Which, by the way, is the aristocrat is not necessarily a monarchist. He's either a monarchist or an aristocracy, a rule by a few. Not by many. We've taken democracy off the table, but it goes aristocracy, then timarchy, rule of honor, oligarchy, rule of money, democracy, rule by the many, freedom, all that, and then tyranny at the bottom, which is just the raw exercise of power. And the thing is, politics, especially at scale, will always attract tyrants because they just want it the most, and they're very good at impersonating the appearance of good characters. They can Patrick Bateman their way into making you believe they're a good person. Look at like Gavin Newsom. Look at Justin Trudeau. They're all like this Christian Bale smile. They're like the spitting image of Patrick Bateman. And many leaders are like that. So what do we do in relation to that? Well, without retreating from politics, but without getting so invested in some doomed mission to fix a stationary feature of human existence for all of recorded history, Plato offers us an option, which is to look at the part of our soul that's driving us and say, okay, well, that part can be either like tyrannical or democratic or aristocratic or maybe oligarchic. We can have different core motivations. And we can look at that part of ourselves and try to improve ourselves. And this can sound so like Christian in the lamest way. We'll just pray about it. We're not talking about that. We're talking about improving ourselves because the city comes to reflect its people. The constitution of a country ultimately is its people, as de Maistre says. So the most important civic thing we can do is not, and this sounds so cliche, it sounds so lame, but it sounds so cliche and lame because it's been said many times, and it's said many times because it is true. The best civic thing we can do is to improve ourselves, to become more noble and virtuous ourselves. And if we are really inspiring, if we are so aristocratic that other people look at you and be like, I would follow them, then you are. Then they are following you. That's what that is. When people look at you and are inspired and say, I would follow you, they are following you. If you have ideas that people in power are like absolute psychopaths in power, are like, wow, that idea would click with a lot of people. I sense opportunity here. I'm going to take that. The psychopath isn't controlling you and stealing from you. You are guiding this monster, this psychopath, and you are harnessing them away from being a recidivist violent felon and towards being, I don't know, like a special forces soldier or a neurosurgeon or something. A lot of neurosurgeons are psychopaths. Interesting detail. There is a place for these people in society, just as there is a place for schizotypal people, as like priests and shamans and so forth. So, or amateur philosophers. I don't know. So, and this character in ourselves, I think, will dictate where we are inclined to think in situations of ambiguity or uncertainty. Are we inclined towards construction and the preservation and creation of quality, or are we inclined by default to destruction? Do we have that tyrannical, and the tyrant is described by Plato as like this, like a wolf who has tasted human flesh and they need to keep going. There's like a high that you get from destroying something, and you're like, ooh, that felt good. I had a Nietzschean dopamine hit of feeling my power increase, and now I'm an addict. My libido dominandi is being fed, and I need more. I think the danger of accelerationism is it taps into that, because it's actually not hard to break things. It's much easier to break things than it is to build them. I say that as someone who's done a lot of demo work in construction. Sometimes we do have to tear things down in order to build them. But usually, that demo work that we do, we already have a blueprint in mind for what we want to replace it with. We're like, okay, we're going to be putting this new, commercial space in here. So we need to tear down this wall. We need to undo this panel. Then we're going to put 2 new panels over here. We're going to put 2 new walls in, and it'll be good from there. That mentality is huge. And I think the danger we see in the mentality of many accelerationists is they don't actually have a plan in mind for what they want to replace it with. Which, when you look into that desire, that instinct, it's a destructive instinct that I think they don't even want to be led by. Like, if that character within themselves were personified in the government as their new president, they would still be accelerationists to get away from that. So what kind of character, what kind of persona in yourself would be leading your life that, if they were made manifest on the outside, you would defend your culture and your country on behalf of? You would say, I would die for you, my king. Like Boromir to Aragorn. Let that be the character that leads you. This sounds like an evasive thing when we're talking about external politics, but it isn't, because at the end of the day, our country is us. Our country is us. It's not a sheet of paper. Our country is us, and there are no more gratifying moments for me than when I talk to an older person, and based on how I talk to them, you can sometimes see a kind of spark of hope in their eye. Like, oh my gosh, like, the future is bright. I was given this book. This is not originally my book. My copy of The Republic is over there. It was given to me by a customer who happened to be a professor at Harvard of psychology from 96. Because I was installing some lights in his house, and he said, and we were talking about philosophy and psychology and stuff, and he gave me his copy of The Republic, just as an expression of hope and gratitude. That, and I had the wonderful vicarious experience of seeing that in David Starkey when he was interviewing Carl Benjamin. I think it was a few days ago. I was just listening to it earlier today. And it was so pleasant to hear the joy and the hope in David Starkey's voice, hearing this new, younger generation of politically involved men who care and who want to preserve their country, And that hope is a powerful thing, So being the sort of person that motivates others, especially the older people in your country, also motivates yourself. There's a reflexivity that is positive as well as destructive, we might say, or reflective, we might say. So that is why I think grand accelerationism is incorrect. Sort of a very, very long-winded way of putting it. This is probably the longest office hours I've done in a while. And while I think Ian brings up some very, very valid concerns and dangers and real problems that do need to be addressed, like accelerating into a civil war does not guarantee what the outcome will be. And it doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to solve these problems faster either. History is replete with examples of countries that went through periods of communism that staggered along for 60 or 70 years or longer. One could make the argument that China is still kind of in some residual form of communism, or in a power structure that was put in place by communism and still has the stamp of its influence in how it treats its people and so forth. So I think we ought to be very careful with accelerationism in the grand scheme of things, while not necessarily taking it off the table at smaller, more precise instances. So anyways, and hopefully that addressed some of the incentive problems as well, which are important. Incentives do matter, but there are counterforces there in the nature of politics. I think we can embrace this is where I think Curtis Yarvin would come in with his own sort of accelerationism of sorts, the defeatist kind, and say, well, if politics is going to be psychopathic, which it is, we can at least, in acknowledging it, be more open about it. And in being more open, in accepting the truly psychopathic nature of this thing, the openness allows for a degree of accountability that these pleasant delusions that we have about, voting and so forth, actually obscure and hide and allow a lot more worse things to go on in the background and maybe even require terrible things. Here's a terrible thought experiment for you. Suppose all of the horrible things that have been going on, not just on Jeffrey Epstein's island and in Diddy's mansion, but in every other kind of blackmail operation that seems to be the barrier to entry into politics for all politicians for like all time, as far as we can tell. Is there something in the democratic desire for an illusion of participation that makes that required? In other words, did we, in our desire to be democratically powerful as citizens, in some way contribute to the necessity of this? And I don't mean this to take away any of the blame from the people who rightfully belong under a lamppost somewhere. We don't need to go further. We're all thinking the same thing. But still worth pondering, So, anyways, I went on more than long enough, double the length I had intended to go. So, with all that being said, feel free to check out the links I'll attach below. Thanks so much for listening, and take care.